Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. Tonight is one of those nights. It's June 29th, apparently. That's what my computer tells me, at least. And with me, you'll notice that I don't have anybody below. We've gone equalitarian on Shop Talk, so directly to one of my directions is Tracy Baggiano.
Hello.
And also a cattail.
Quake.
Approximately one quarter of a cat. And even further away from me, I'm Norman.
Hello there. Good evening.
All right, so the way that Shop Talk works is you ask questions, we make up answers. Sometimes we make them up on the spot. Sometimes I write them out beforehand and pretend that I made them up on the spot. So that way, when they're terrible answers, I can always say, no, I just made it up on the spot. I certainly didn't think about this before. So if you have questions, SQL Server, Data Platform World, drop them in chat. Love to hear about them, and that generally drives the topic of conversation for the night. You can interact here on Twitch. You can see the email address down right on the screen below. And if you want to reach out to us, go for it.
Hey, I see you're advertising tonight for Carlos.
I am doing a little bit of advertising. So this was a SQL Trail 2018. One of back in the days when we could go to public events. Those were the days.
Those were the days.
The first question for tonight actually came in via email, and it was about querying system functions. It was an interesting question. It was basically, how can I get the list of all system functions available in SQL Server? You can see them in Management Studio, which says that obviously they're queryable somewhere because Management Studio had to get them from someplace. So where does that come from? And I've whipped up a very tiny demo to cover that idea. So I'm going to share my screen. Maybe. Here we go. Here comes Azure Data Studio. And let's go full screen on this. Now, what I have is the sys.system SQL modules table. You may be familiar with SQL modules. So SQL modules is the list of definitions of views, functions, and stored procedures. System SQL modules is the list of, obviously, system objects. And this is joined to the all objects table. Again, in a normal scenario, we're used to joining SQL modules with sys.objects. And this would allow us to communicate and get the list of user objects. Now, I'm in master. I don't have anything. But if I switch over to, for example, I think I have something in one of these. Let's say ZDT. Nope. Oops. This shows how well I've prepared everything. Everything is excellent. So I go to this ZDT database, and there's still no objects because, well, I don't have any functions in there because I don't like functions very much. But if I change this to system modules and all objects, and we look for where it's not in type P or V. P is stored procedure, V is view. We run this, and we're going to get the scalar functions, inline functions, multi-statement aggregate functions, and so on. So that gives us the list of all of the functions. Incidentally, because these are system functions, they're available in every database. I'm in the ZDT database. I got back 130 rows. If I switch to MSDB, I still get 130 rows. So it's the same set of database objects on this installation. There was a follow-up question about some things like, for example, object ID. So obviously, object ID is a function. It takes an input parameter and returns a result. And yet, object ID won't show up when you query all objects or system SQL modules. This is what is known as a metadata function. So there's a list of, about 30 or so of these metadata functions, like even something like SPID, although it doesn't take any parameters, is still technically considered a metadata function from what I was reading. And basically they are there, but I don't believe that, at least I have not seen any system views or system tables which show you where those actually live. You know, where the definition for object ID comes in. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can see me again. Oh my gosh, it's me. And wrap that up by saying that sys.system SQL modules joined to sys.all objects will at least give you most of them. I would have to conjecture about some things like file stream or change tracking objects, because I didn't see any of those on this machine, but I also don't have file stream enabled or change tracking enabled, which means that maybe those objects only get installed when I enable a feature. But that's conjecture. I don't have proof on that.
I believe that is true.
Also, full text search, same concept. Even within full text search, there are a couple of functions that I was able to see, and some of the functions I was not able to see, but I think that they are metadata functions. Who knows? That's my way of punting on the answer while giving at least 80%. So Tom, you have a topic about sending data to a third-party product.
Yeah, so a lot of times as DBAs, you would think that SQL Server basically has everything we want. For example, like SSRS, Power BI, whatever. But what if your company buys a third-party product? And you're now going to send your data off to a third-party product to munge all the data. And you're not going to do the ETL from SQL Server. You're just going to send the data and let it basically transform, load, and then they'll extract what they want on the third-party product. So your real question is, okay, depending on how you're doing that, if you build a bunch of gadgets, widgets, whatever, and you have a table that has 10 fields, 15 fields, but you're building that widget off there, and you hope the person building it doesn't do a select star, right? Because if you go add 3 fields to that, all of a sudden you break that third-party product widget. So how would you go about going and preventing that third party, or not preventing, but at least notifying or preventing, you could prevent it, to allow someone to change an object that reads that table and or that table itself? So I've got some ideas of how to do it. One would be using a view. If you use a view, you can obfuscate it and basically put in schema binding, so you can't change it till you take that off. Another one is SQL audit. Turn around and audit the table, and maybe you're auditing when it hits your QA environment or something like that. Dev can do it, but once it hits the QA environment, it'll alert you and possibly block if you want to block it. So what are some other thoughts of how you would go in and basically say, okay, this table has been pushed to the third-party product. I don't want any changes to that third-party, to that table, unless something's raised to tell me that's there. Now, you might also have that in a SSRS situation, right? Especially if they're not using stored procedures, but they're actually embedding the queries within the reports. I hate that, but I've got a guy that loves to do that. And I don't know how many times when we've deployed, we've broken his reports. So what are y'all's thoughts? How would you handle that scenario? I gave you a couple that I would think of.
Yeah, the first thing I thought of when I heard about this was DDL triggers. Basically, I can put a DDL trigger on for any insert update or any any table modification statement on that object and prevent it, or at least log that information someplace. SQL audit is definitely a good choice. It's certainly a much more, what would I call it, enterprise ready choice. And I mean that in the positive way, not the pejorative way of enterprisey, where you're adding complexity for the sake of being complex. But when you have to handle a lot of tables or a lot of different scenarios, yeah, SQL audit's going to be a really good option.
See, I was voting for the DDL triggers, but also I hate select stars. So to prevent that, I'd put a computed column on the end that would divide 1 by 0 so they couldn't do a select star. Just so I could prevent both of them.
But what if they're doing that select star technically on the third-party product as they're pulling the data back and you don't know it?
You got to fix it before they start doing that shit.
Yeah, that's
Bug
true.
ticket.
That is very true.
Yeah.
Before they start using the select star, you put it in there and then they can't do it no more.
Yeah.
Yeah, computed column is a good way of messing up somebody's code. Policy-based management is another option in here because it's designed for this kind of thing. At least this was one of the things that they actually implemented.
I wasn't even thinking about policy-based management. That's interesting.
Yeah, under the covers, it's essentially DML triggers, if I remember correctly. Yeah. But I will warn you, everybody, that I'm a little down with the sickness tonight. So I'm only like 60% tonight. So as a result, anything I'm liable to say, you might want to triple check it as opposed to normal double checking it.
Yeah, all right, PBM, as I call it, was one that that's pretty old technology. Okay.
Yeah, been around since 2008 at least.
Yeah.
Is it 8 or 5?
I think it was.
We went with at least 8. It might have been 5.
I was thinking it's 5. I thought I taught a class on it back in 2005. So that's how long I've been teaching. Too long.
So the Duke mentions there are some people I know who do crazy stuff like select star from a table with no where clause or limit. They do a cancel after 2,000 rows, but it's such a bad practice. Yeah, that's a terrible practice. So there's a buddy of mine who, when new analysts come in, it's almost a game of how long before they get booted off. So what happens is that there's this big table that's something like 1 trillion or so rows. And there's a view. It's a fairly complicated view. And when trying to understand, okay, well, what's in here? New people inevitably at some point do a select star from the table with no where clause, with no top. And there's a process that will automatically kick them. It'll automatically kill their session if they spend more than a certain amount of time accessing this table. Which makes sense because it's apparently a very, very heavily used table, given that it's like 1 trillion rows. And you don't want people running select star because, well, even if they don't kick the person off and kill their session, at some point you run out of memory in Management Studio and it crashes, or you run out of memory on your computer and you have problems. It's just not a pretty scenario to be in.
Hopefully they're not running that and did a remote desktop to the production server and ran it.
No. This is not the type of environment where they would allow that.
Yeah.
This is an environment where they've got their stuff down. Solomon mentions reasons not to add a 1 divided by 0 computed column. making support and debugging harder, and there is, or at least used to be, some performance hit in some scenarios for having the computed column, even if you didn't do a select star. So you'd still have to do the work, I suppose, even if you don't query the column, because it's not a persistent computed column, and you can't persist select 1 over 0.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is...
That was just a mean trick.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't
recommend doing it everywhere. I'd only do it if it was really, really important not to run a select star on a particular table.
Makes sense. Do it when people deserve it, not as
Or
a general
just do it
practice.
all in development and not anywhere else. That way the developers would learn not to do it.
Just do it on random tables. Random tables in the dev environment.
Yeah, every night change which tables it's on. And
Yep. They'll learn. So
Cool.
SQL audit, triggers, PBM, and it sounds like...
SQL audit. Yep. 3 choices.
Yeah, sounds like a good set of options. And a lot of them use very similar technologies to actually do the work. So under the covers, if I remember right, most of it's just DML triggers.
I think SQL audit uses extended events.
They use extended events to collect information on it. If you want to force an operation to happen, I don't remember if audit actually allows you to do ops. Policy-based management, if you wanted some action to occur as opposed to just logging the information, then they used DML triggers, if I remember right.
Yeah, it's like policy-based management. You can turn around and say, okay, you changed this, but I'm flipping it back.
Yep.
They'd never figure out why their stored procedure would never go in.
Yep.
You know, so
Yeah, well, there were actually some good reasons. I had policy-based management that would do things like, no, you don't get to create a stored procedure with SP underscore.
yeah.
There are specific naming conventions, and you could set certain naming conventions for objects, including databases, and it's stuff that you ought to catch in code reviews, but sometimes it slips, and nice to have the backstop.
Yeah, it is.
Especially when, there's a performance hit from having these triggers in place whenever you do a data definition. See, I've been saying DML the whole time. I meant DDL, data definition language. What I told you, 60%. And
You did say that.
when you're creating or modifying a table, yeah, it's going to be a little slower because you're running a trigger. But most environments probably are not creating and modifying tables at ludicrous numbers. Temp tables can be an exception, though. If I remember right, with policy-based management, you could only look at you could avoid temp tables, but I could be making stuff up. So take that to the bank.
All right.
Next topic. Mala asked, unfortunately Mala couldn't be here tonight, so we will answer the question for her. SQL audit can only fail the operation or shut down the instance or do nothing. Okay, thanks for the clarification. I remembered the ability to shut down the instance. Basically, it would be fail open or fail closed. And I didn't remember failing the operation, but it's fair.
You can definitely alert on it though, because I do run SQL audit to check and see if my TDE certificate's expired or not. And once it starts expiring 30 days out, it'll start alerting me and saying, hey, you know, there's this certificate out there that's going to expire. Go do something about it.
Right.
So I know there's ways of actually alerting. And that's the main thing, is you just want something that's going to alert you to basically turn around and say, okay, go fix this.
Sure. Audit's a really useful tool. So
Yep.
Mala asks about containers and databases. Essentially, the question is, what gives? How or why would we containerize a database? And at this high level, I'm not going to show you any demos today, but did want to talk about the topic of databases and containers, because the early days of containers were all about stateless processing, and databases are entirely state-based. You very rarely have a database that you want to be stateless. Which, in those cases when you do, that's where something like non-persistent memory optimized tables can work out. Because, okay, I have a queue table, and in the event that everything blows up and the table goes away, I'll just rebuild the queue. Or staging tables for an ETL process. Yeah, those don't necessarily need a persistent state because I can rerun the ETL process. But most of the time in our lives, we want our databases to retain the data that we put into them. And that becomes a little bit of a problem with containers because the idea of a container is it is ephemeral. You instantiate it based off of some image, based off of some mold. You do some stuff with it, and when you're ready to, you destroy it. You replace it with some new version of itself. That helps a lot with scenarios like I never have to upgrade a server because all I have to do is spin up a new container with those updates that I've already been able to check in another environment, and I don't have to worry about some upgrade going bad on a machine. So the idea of containers has taken hold. I think it's a very interesting concept, and we've seen some of it in the data world. But to this point, not an incredible amount. Now, I'd put it as... Oh, sorry,
do you know anybody that's actually moved it and started doing it in production now?
Do I know people who have containers in production scenarios? I don't recall.
I don't know of anybody that has actually done it in production yet. I know a couple that were working that way, but not actually have made it to production yet.
Yeah, if anybody in chat has scenarios where they've containerized production databases, I'd love to hear about that. I have not any recollection at the moment, but it doesn't mean I didn't have some conversation with somebody at some point. So if I did and I forgot about it, I'm just going to blame being sick. This is a really great excuse tonight. All the places where I'm wrong is like, oh, I'm just sick. I'm sure I would have gotten it right if I weren't sick. I wouldn't actually.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's really, really interesting from the standpoint of, I think within 5 years we're going to see it, pretty much in production in different areas. But it's one of those kind of like VMs that I think is just going to take time to get there, to get people being sold on it and other people going out and doing it and stuff. So it'd be interesting to know, like, under the covers, will they ever, for example, Azure SQL database, will it be a container someday? So.
Yeah, there's it gets interesting because in cloud scenarios, containers are pretty popular. You have things like Elastic Container Repository in AWS or Azure Container Registry in Azure, and their corresponding ability to launch things using Fargate in AWS or ACI in Azure. Both of them have Kubernetes services. So there's this push for containers, and that I do have cases of code in production that's running entirely containerized, but it's application code as opposed to databases.
Right.
It's also interesting because containers are almost inherently insecure. They're not a security measure because you're still sharing all of the underlying libraries, which is part of how containers are so much lighter weight than virtual machines. So securing a container in a world where you have rogue containers is difficult and to the point where it might be impossible. There's a couple of articles about this that I've read in the past, and those articles were kind of interesting and just a little bit concerning. But that may prevent certain companies from moving, well, anything to containers, and definitely data-related operations into containers. Now, I think if you're hosting the hardware, that's not nearly as big of a problem versus if it's on a cloud provider where technically anybody could get access. There, you have to make sure that you have to hope that there are no real problems with the containerization service. So,
Yeah, that's you know, with all the data privacy and everything else that's out there, that's, you know, ramping up quite a bit. It's going to be interesting to see what we do.
So there are a couple of approaches if you decide that you do want to put databases into containers. And I think there are good reasons why you would want to. One of the really good reasons for me is andragogy. In other words, teaching people. I want to be able to run through, say, a talk of mine, and I want somebody else to be able to run the same code. Historically, I personally have not done the greatest job of putting together coherent scripts that get you to the state that I need your system to be in, especially when we start integrating in things like Jupyter notebooks. I need versions of Python and R installed. I need libraries installed. I need things configured. I need these SQL databases set up with this data. And that can be a little time consuming and difficult for someone who is trying to learn from a presenter. So containers make my life a lot easier because all I have to do is say, all right, if you're using Docker on your machine, go pull this container, and here's how you start it up. And then now you have SQL Server with the database that you need, with all of the data pre-populated. You have the web application that's going to go read that data, so you can follow along in the code as well, but you have everything that you need to follow along. You know, you have working copies of things. So that sort of training is much easier in a container world. I definitely wouldn't.
It's called labs.azure.com.
So yes, Azure Labs is another option. Azure Notebooks for certain things. But, you know, if I want to...
It's cheap.
Yeah, it's cheap, but it's not free. And, yeah, well, I mean, I want to train people, but I don't want to pay for it. It's
55 cents an hour.
Yeah, that adds up to like dollars a month. Does my background look like I can afford dollars per month?
No, your backdrop fell down or something. So
no, I just am not. I'm not doing any video recording, so the green screen is at half mast. If I do video recording again sometime soon, then I just pull the green screen up, lift it so that it fills in the whole screen, and now I've got green screen. But I've been pretty lazy about not taking it apart, so it just sits back there. So, all right, we have training. We also, Azure Labs, L-A-B-S, John fan, not Azure Labs. I'm afraid what Azure Labs would take you to. So I'm not even going to click on that link.
I'm getting ready to teach a class that I'm going to be using labs.azure.com, and the template that you build up that template, and then they actually, when they start their own VM up, it's identical to whatever your template is. It's like phenomenal. It's really, really nice. But yeah, you're going to pay for it. You know, basically I'm going to be paying for the lab that these people are using. So
yeah. And you know, if you're getting paid in return, that's absolutely fair. Azure Lab Services, I'm not going to knock it. It's a really good service. I know people who do train full time who do use it and enjoy it a lot. So that is certainly an option. Now, the other reason why,
But you do have to be trained, be paid for the class, or inherently wealthy to train other people and do it for free for them.
yeah, or willing to budget that money. You know,
Right.
I guess the good side is that unless you have some extremely popular course, as long as you constrain how many hours the learner can have it open, which you can do with Azure Lab Services,
Right.
then you can put a cap on how much any person can cost you. And if it ends up being a couple of dollars, you know, you may have a few people a month. So it's not that bad in the grand scheme of things, but it's not free.
No, it's not free. It's actually right now, if we're doing all virtual, it's actually pretty cheap because we're not paying all that T&E anymore. So,
That's true. That's true.
so right now it's cheaper than getting on a plane and flying somewhere and getting a hotel and a car rental and food and whatever else.
This is true.
Less fun.
It's a lot less fun.
It is a lot less fun. You're right. I'd much rather travel.
So, all right, we've got training as an option for containers. The other option is that I've seen quite often is QA scenarios. I want to be able to run the same set of tests over and over against this database and expect the same results. Given that databases are inherently stateful, that's troublesome because as soon as you insert a new row, well, I can't insert that same row again if I have unique constraints. I can't ensure that the same values are there, and my testing becomes a lot vaguer. That, yeah, you inserted a row, but I don't necessarily know that these numbers add up the way they should. So, what containers would allow you to do is create a gold copy of that testing database and run those tests, tear down the database. Next check-in, run those tests, tear down the database. As people change the database, they're going to have to change their tests. But you can have, like, if I add a new table and I have some new metadata for that table, I can create new tests around that. I can update the image and pull the latest image, run the tests against that. If I add new information to an existing table, it's another sign, hey, I need to update those tests. But as long as tables remain fairly stable, I can have the same set of tests running over and over and ensure that we're going to production with this information, that everything is working right. These reports are working right, that the numbers I'm getting in different systems tie together. And it becomes a lot easier to automatically test when you have the data in containers. There are some options that you can follow otherwise. Database snapshots are an option. You could also restore the database after you're done with your tests, but if your database is fairly large, that may take a while. So, not necessarily the best option.
The only problem that I would currently espouse, that if you're not a Linux shop, then the containers right now, they're not doing a whole lot in the Windows world. And if you're a total Windows shop, then unless you go buy a third-party tool, you're kind of shut out right now.
Yeah, maybe not quite shut out, but I absolutely understand your concern. Windows containers at the moment are a bit of a joke.
They're not giving any love.
No. So there is a SQL Server container for Windows. It runs Express Edition. It is not officially supported by Microsoft. It's kind of in preview status. And the Linux container is absolutely supported, even in production scenarios, if I remember right. Now, they give you... Actually, it might not be supported for production scenarios, because I think they installed Developer Edition on there. But it is a supported container. If you have problems with it, they will fix those problems. So, you're right. Windows containers don't get much in the way of love. The way that I see Windows moving, Windows subsystem for Linux is essentially obviating the need for Windows containers, I think. Because
Well, and that's the whole point is now with the latest version of Windows 10, you have the WSL2 underlying, so you don't even really, you're getting to more of a point that you can run the Linux. But how close are they to the Windows version of developer? Are they getting all the feature functionality there? I know last time I looked, there was something still missing.
for developer edition on a Windows container,
A Linux container
oh,
doesn't
on a
have the same
Linux
thing.
container,
Doesn't have the same thing as the Windows version of it.
that is true. There is still a pretty big gap in what's available for SQL Server on Linux versus SQL Server on Windows. One thing that comes right off the top of my head is Polybase v1. That is Azure Blob Storage and Hadoop. They don't have any Java connectors installed on the Linux installation of SQL Server. So there are certainly differences between what is available SQL Server on Linux and SQL Server on Windows. That developer space is fairly close, though, until you get to some of the edge scenarios like Polybase.
Like encryption. If I want to turn around and actually in a development environment, I don't want to run, say, Azure Key Vault for the developer. I actually want to just let him run with the Windows certificate store instead. So,
And the Linux containers do let you run enterprise or standard or developer or enterprise core.
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Because I knew with SQL Server on Linux, it was just straight up Linux. It was you choose a configuration flag on install.
Yeah, they've got the container set up that way as well now.
So it's interesting with what you're saying, and with the Windows operating system now supporting Linux and stuff, it's almost like, are we going to see within the next 3 to 5 years, are we going to see that basically Windows is going to not be supported anymore?
No.
Are you sure?
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm positive. I am. I don't care if I'm sick. I would put money that SQL Server 2025 or whatever will still be on Windows.
What about 2030? 10 years from now?
Well, as long as Windows is around, SQL Server will be around on Windows.
Yeah.
So,
because that's one way Microsoft technically could save money is basically if the Windows Server subsystem wasn't needed anymore and everything's running on containers, Linux base, they could save money there.
maybe. Except Vorja points out, except they'd lose money. Yeah, Microsoft would probably lose money on net there. Yeah, I don't. So there are good reasons why SQL Server would not leave Windows. One of them is because 90+%, I'm going to say 99%, 99% of the install base is on Windows.
Right.
And a very large percentage of those are not going over to Linux. I don't mind SQL Server on Linux. I use it. I've got, like I mentioned, I've got Docker containers that I use. Those are all SQL Server on Linux. I've tried it out for different projects. I've got a Raspberry Pi over here running SQL Server on Ubuntu. So I've got no problems with it. But in an enterprise environment, it seems like it's pretty difficult to get adoption because your tech base is generally going to be Windows developers, Windows sysadmins. And given that there are limitations today, some of those limitations I don't think are ever getting fixed or even fixed. There are scenarios where I don't think you're ever going to see movement to Linux. Like, for example, first thing, let me drop in the unsupported features listing for SQL Server on Linux. And the very first thing on there is merge replication.
Yeah, I don't need that.
Any company
If you're-
using merge replication,
If you're FedEx or UPS, you might need that.
oh yeah, I know companies that do use merge replication, and
What?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's painful, very painful.
yes, it
But
is.
it is there, and given Microsoft's lack of love for merge replication, I don't think that they're going to want to take the time to migrate that merge replication code over. They have moved transactional replication over. And transactional replication is probably 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more popular than merge replication. So
Who wants to be doing conflict resolution all the time?
if you set it up right, you don't have conflicts to resolve. And also, you don't use identity columns that are usable across the entire range of things. And also, you don't have gigantic tables with tens of millions of rows everywhere.
Kevin,
Yeah.
you just shot my whole database.
Oh, I deal with somebody who has that set up, and it is sometimes painful because it'll be like, hey, merge replication is slowed down. Why? Can you tell me how long it'll take to catch back up? Nope.
Nope.
Technically, you might be able to figure out a way to check the merge replication tables and get an idea of all of the merge objects that need to be moved over, the generations that need to be processed. And by the way, if you're using transactional replication, there are some nice scripts that do that for you and give you an idea of how far behind you are. For merge replication, it's basically, yeah, wait till it's done.
Go drink some coffee.
But there are some things that, companies will not move over to Linux for. And for example, AD authentication for linked servers. AD authentication in general is a little difficult. If I remember right, AD authentication is now possible on Linux, but I know 2017 it wasn't. And there are companies that don't want you to use SQL authentication for anything.
Amen.
Yeah.
Do not use SQL auth for anything.
And yet, if you're using a bunch of different tools, SQL auth is required.
You just don't use those tools. That's all you do. You don't support AD, I don't use you.
Don't
Oh,
use
poor
link servers
apologies.
either. Yuck.
No, I do not use link servers. No.
I'm trying to find a feature I need. It's not supported. So I can go to my boss and say, let's move to Linux. Wait a minute, I couldn't go to 2019, so never mind.
So, moral of that story is that I believe that there are some things that SQL Server on Linux will never support. This is all just my personal belief. Like SQL Server 2020X could come out and suddenly support merge replication on Linux, and I'd say, "Oh wow, that's actually kind of cool." But if I were to put money on yes or no, I would definitely bet on the no. You win a lot more than yes on that case.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think part of the problem of even getting SQL Server in Linux in any shop is if you don't have the system administrators that know how to work with Linux, then you're basically not going to move your SQL Server to Linux.
Yeah. So Icon Pro asks, what auth options are there besides SQL and Active Directory?
That's it.
On-prem, yes. In an Azure environment, you have Azure Active Directory.
Still
And
Active Directory, though.
It's still Active Directory, but it's not Windows authentication. It's not integrated auth. One thing that I actually appreciate about Azure Active Directory is
MFA,
sorry.
MFA support.
There's MFA support. That's one nice thing about it. Also, when you're in Management Studio, let me share screen one more time here. Look at how classy this evening's shop talk is. I've got 2 screen sharing, including one which was entirely unexpected. So, our options for integration with SQL Server. Windows Auth. We know it, we love it. Ties in with Active Directory on premises. You know, it's really good. It's really good. Downside is that I can't put in any sort of Windows Auth credentials. And the closest option that I could do for that is to run SSMS as net only and then put in some credentials.
Correct.
Works, but a little messy. SQL authentication. So I notice that my login is SA. That's double boo.
So login we need, Tom, SA.
What's that?
I told him that was the only login we needed was SA.
That's true.
Boo.
At least I didn't check remember password this time. So then
that's
there
really
are
bad, Kevin. That's really bad.
I know he's using it. How long he's going to tell it to remember the password?
I prepped beforehand and unchecked the box.
Great difference.
So we've got 3 other options. Azure Active Directory. So you can. This is actually one that I want to see for Windows Auth, where you can still put in your username and password for Azure AD. That way, I could sign in as Tom if I know Tom's password because I'm trying to troubleshoot something, or he can put his password in on my machine, and we can troubleshoot an issue as him.
Never.
You have multi-factor authentication, as Tom pointed out. I could put in username and get a text or buzzing on my phone or an email or something.
Or the Authenticator app.
Or the Authenticator app, yep. Or Azure AD integrated, where if I'm already connected using Azure AD, say if I'm on a VM in Azure, then I can directly connect to a SQL Server instance that way. So essentially there are 2 plus...
On-prem, there's only 2, really. Well, you could technically use your Azure there if you've got your Azure AD hooked up to your on-prem AD.
Yes, but I've never seen a company do that. And it might be for good reason.
No?
No, I haven't. However, I just haven't worked at too many companies, reasonably sized companies that are Azure heavy.
I'll have to ask, but I think the company I work at, the 2 are tied together.
Okay.
I think. So, but since I don't do that, I'm not sure. But
right.
Anyway.
That's fair. That's fair. So yeah, that's the answer. Essentially, there are 2 mechanisms, and if you're in Azure, you get a few other options to still use Active Directory. So it's still really 2 mechanisms. You just get a few more if you're in Azure. A few more ways to use the one mechanism.
And I agree with you, Kevin. There are times that your hands tied and forced to where you have to use SQL Auth. But anytime I have to use SQL Auth, then of course I've got all the appropriate boxes checked to make sure that you have to change your password and and abide by the AD rules and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, I don't like SQL Auth either. Actually, I'm still a little bitter that Polybase has been broken since CU3 to where you can't use Windows authentication when creating or working with external objects. They've at least got it up to the point in CU5 that it no longer dies and It's no longer an error of level 21 when you attempt to query an external table. So that's positive, I guess. Now it just
Well,
gives you a level 16
they're
error that says you can't query the table.
they're getting there. They're working, working their way up. So
Get it down to a level 10 error that just prints out text. By the way, this query didn't work. Be better to fix the problem, but hopefully, I'm hoping CU6 fixes it. We'll see. As we wrap up tonight, looks like we got about 10 minutes. One more topic on here.
So I'm gonna throw you a curve. So Apple last week, Apple announced their new MacBook Pros, right? Running
Yep.
on ARMs. And I saw that I have a few Mac guys like going, uh-oh, what are we gonna do with our Windows capability that we need to run on their Mac machines?
Yeah, and what I've heard so far is Boot Camp will not be supported.
Right, exactly.
So connect to VMs.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting one.
It will be. It will be. You can do some things like SQL Server on ARM is a thing.
You can go back to your containers. You can run your containers on there.
You can. Although containers may have to be built for ARM as opposed to x86. I'm thinking about IoT scenarios where when you build, you have to actually have a deployment for ARM specifically. So you can't just use x86 because, unlike a VM, you can't emulate those instructions. The instructions have to be there.
Right.
Actually, even with a VM, I'm pretty sure you can't emulate the CPU instructions.
So all you Apple folks that might be going out there to buy a brand new MacBook Pro with ARM, you might want to think again if you're running SQL Server, if you're a SQL Server person.
Yeah, or you get a Azure VM and connect to that Azure VM when you need to work on anything SQL Server related. Azure Data Studio, I don't think works on ARM today.
No, they're going to have to port it. So probably.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. I'm not a Mac person.
How many things is Apple breaking that Microsoft has ported over to Apple? Office, who all know, all the PowerPoint, all the stuff that they're breaking.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And I am not a Mac person, so I am assuredly missing some information, plenty of information, but yeah, it doesn't. I'm not sure how great of a decision it is. Incidentally, I did hear that it was the reason that Apple decided to go ARM was actually because Skylake was such a bad processor series. So, a little bit of a rant as we close Shop Talk, because you can't have Shop Talk without a rant. I have a Surface Pro 4. I bought the Surface Pro 4 3 years ago, and I used it for about 2 years, year and a half, 2 years as a backup machine. Then I gave it to my wife, and she uses it, watch videos and whatever. Well, if anybody remembers the Surface Pro 4, there was an entire controversy around hardware problems in that device. There were a couple of controversies. One was that screen flicker would happen to the point where you had ghosting on the screen. It just looked really bad. And sometimes that was firmware related. Sometimes it was a thermal problem where the fan wasn't in the right place for the Surface Pro, and a certain component would get overheated and then the glue would loosen up a little bit, so the display would get all wonky. Well, those Intel processors that they used were Skylake, and that batch of processors had so many bugs. The thing I was reading was that Apple apparently was finding as many bugs as Intel found in their processors. And you know it's bad when your customer is reporting more bugs than your QA team can find.
That is bad.
Yeah, that whole wrecked generation. And remember, that was also a year or so before AMD came back on with a real processor. And Threadripper and Ryzen are great processors. But at that point in time, basically Intel was sitting on its laurels. They really messed up that generation of processors and got to the point where Apple decided they were going to switch. They weren't going to use Intel. And I guess they went their own route with ARM. I don't know how well it's going to work for them in the end, especially if you want that support for things like the Adobe Suite or Microsoft Office or whatever. Who knows? Maybe they'll come up with maybe there will be enough demand for official support for these, but my guess is that there will be a lot of VMs.
It's going to be it's going to be interesting, or it is interesting, of how many boardrooms or product rooms are now scrambling probably to get their products to support ARM.
I'm not sure. There may be a lot, but I guess it's how big of the market is that really? And there's a comment here, at least they didn't revert back to PowerPC. That's a fair point. That's a fair point. You know, those 68K processors, they were pretty good. Maybe give them another chance.
You've already got Word, Excel, and Photoshop that they've already developed, supposedly.
Okay.
So that gives them a head start.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, if they're able to migrate over a majority of that stuff, the positive side there is, okay, well, you know, you could tie it in with iOS and the tablet and phone spaces, and then also bring it over into the Android world potentially. So there's, I guess if you look at it from that angle, there is a potential pretty good market, but it seems it's going to be interesting.
It's going to be interesting to see if the Intel world versus the x86 world versus the ARM world, that if in 5 years, it's almost like the VHS beta tapes. It's like, okay, who's going to win the race? Who's going to win? Who's going to be, you know, are we going to see like even the PCs, you know, the Windows PCs switch over to ARM and stuff? So it'd be interesting to see.
That is interesting. My inclination would be to say probably not anytime soon, especially because AMD actually is doing good work right now. That they've cut down on power utilization a lot. They've actually got high-end processors that are at least as good as their Intel competitors. So given that AMD's no longer moribund, I think that'll spur Intel on to not suck this time.
Yep, I agree with you.
Just like what happened in the late 90s.
Yeah, they've got some competition. If they're going to stay in business, they've got competition again.
Yeah. So, all right, that's going to wrap up tonight's Shop Talk. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Hopefully we'll see you again next Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And with
hopefully
that,
Kevin feels better next week.
Yeah. This is just a one-day thing. I'm sure I'm going to be feeling fine by tomorrow. But with that, we're going to wrap it up for this evening. So take care, everybody.
All right. Have a good evening.